Today, in part 3 of Antiques in This Old House, we're going to talk about antique textiles. Now, long before factory-made goods appeared in early America, women were responsible for providing their family with all their textiles, their clothing, their blankets, their mattresses, their rugs, their curtains. Just about everything was in the domain of the woman. In order to create these things, she had to do it all by hand. And oftentimes, because her burdens were already pretty heavy, especially out on the rugged frontier, she really didn't have time to make things beautiful. But by the early 18th century, the burdens had really eased up quite a bit, and many people had become more established and comfortable. And women could become more artistic in creating beauty all around them. And it was she had a lot more free time to really embellish her quilts, her coverlets, her clothing. They're going to start out with embroidery, because as far as needlework goes, women had at their disposal everything they needed. They had the needles, they had the thread, and they had the imagination to create some beautiful things. Embroidery, crewel work, needlepoint, and cross-stitch were all different methods employed by the creative woman to embellish her home and for another purpose as well. Samplers came into being as a reason and a purpose for young girls to learn their alphabet and also to learn all the stitches that they would need for future endeavors. One of the earliest pieces of needlework that was found in America was from 1653, and it was done by Captain Miles Standish's daughter. But I'm going to concentrate mostly today on samplers. Samplers in which the alphabet is preeminent and sometimes figures. They're a lot more interesting when there are little figures involved and not just an alphabet, but oftentimes it would simply be the alphabet. And most of what I have here, in fact, all but 2 of my samplers are not antiques. My samplers are not antiques. Let me stress that, because I only have a couple that are actually very old. I generally have reproductions. In other words, they're copies. The patterns were copied from antique samplers. The ones I collect now are not necessarily antiques at all. This one is 1985, and that's one thing to look at when you are, or if you are wanting to collect samplers. The date was always put on them. However, samplers come in kits now, and there are reproduction kits of samplers, and so they have the original date of the sampler on them. For example, this is a copy. This is not an antique sampler, and it's dated 1828. So you've got to be careful. But usually you can really tell an old sampler because it's not going to be in the greatest of shape. This one is done in a really primitive style by a friend of mine long ago, and she just made up the whole design, and she did it in kind of a very childish way, which I think was deliberate. And this one is the same. Collecting samplers, I'm basically looking for the subject matter and the colors. I bought this one because of the reds, and I thought it would look great in this room, but I love the house silhouettes, and this is a very sweet sampler, but it is not an antique. Now, this is one of my old ones. It's not even that old. It's dated 1910. It actually came from Holland, but I love it because it's a great example of how Anna Schultz in 1910 was practicing all her little stitches here. This sort of sampler is also called red work, only done in shades of red. Noticed in any kind of period dramas, whenever the women are sitting there, they're almost always stitching there with a hoop. They're doing their embroidery or needlework, needlepoint, or their cross-stitching. I made this one in 1982, so, well, it's not quite an antique. This is another Dutch sampler, done in red and blue, 1923. So that one's actually 100 years old now. But that's as old as any of mine are. But I don't really think when it comes to this, it matters. If you can get a really beautiful piece of needlework that's hand-done, then that's fantastic. This was done by Nancy, and this is not cross-stitch. Cross-stitch is nothing more than a little cross-stitch, and I think that they're a lot more interesting when they add other sorts of stitches to the cross-stitch, adding embroidery along with the simple cross stitch. By around the 1850s, simple samplers like this were pretty much passé. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, ladies' academies sprung up, and they were teaching young girls really fancy work or elegant sewing, more like this. This beautiful piece was also copied from an antique pattern from 1774. And this has many different types of embroidery stitches on it, and crewel, and I don't believe there is any cross stitch involved in this one at all. This was a Christmas present from a friend of mine a couple years ago. Isn't it beautiful? So I think that you really do not have to have antiques when it comes to needlework. There's so many, if you're looking for an antique look in your house, there's so many great pieces that are available for you that are simply copies of antiques. Let's take a little intermission here. I'll tell you what kind of tea we're drinking today. We are drinking a good colonial bougie made by Oliver Pluff and Company, and this is a simply black tea blend, and it's smoky. It says slightly smoky, but it's very smoky. When you pour that into your cup, you can feel like you're next to a campfire or, okay, a blazing hearth fire. But the teacup is a very super large cup. It's pretty darn old. As you can see, it has lots of stains in it from my drinking coffee in it for years. And this is called Enoch Wood's English Scenery Woodware, Wood & Sons, England, in a mismatched saucer, Wellville China Majestic. Today's darling teapot is called Liverpool. And I love it because it's got these little colonial people on it. And since we're doing needlework and we're doing colonial tea, I thought that would be appropriate. And this was made by Lennox. So we will pour our tea from this little silver wooden handled tea strainer. This does not have a date on it, so I really do not know the age, but it's very elegant and lovely. And it's got a little screen in there. So I put loose tea in the pot so it strains all the little tea leaves in the bottom. Very interesting piece of needlework from Victorian times. This is also embroidery, but it was done on punched paper. So you can see the tiny little pricks in the paper where the needleworker simply drew her needle and thread right through those little holes and followed the design that was printed on the paper. Now also, the colors were filled in for her in many cases. She didn't have to fill it in completely. She didn't do it on the leaves. However, she did fill in the flowers completely. I believe this would have been linen, embroidery thread, and oftentimes wool was used. These can be picked up fairly easily. I got this at an antique store, but I've seen these on eBay pretty consistently. Insistent on getting an antique sampler. Just be very careful because there are so many reproductions out there. You should be able to tell by the age of the fabric just by examining it carefully, and hopefully there'll be some provenance included with an antique sampler that you can verify. But if you're not insistent on getting an antique sampler, there are so many beautiful antique sampler kits. And this is a great example of one from the Scarlet Letter. Here we have an accurate reproduction of a Scottish sampler worked between 1810 and 1820. This one was unsigned and undated, but you can see how beautiful that is. The size of it, when finished, should be 9.5 by 16.5 inches. And these kits generally come with your linen and your embroidery thread. I am so guilty of having kits that I never get around to stitching. I have a whole stack here. I'm just so terrible about it. But I always say, before I die, I will get these finished and then hopefully pass them on to somebody that will appreciate them. There's the Heloise Williams sampler, 18th and 19th century. So if you are going to collect samplers and you want the old look, look for these reproduction kits, because if you love to stitch, or maybe you can get someone to stitch it for you. Remember, when you're looking at samplers, if you see something with an early date on it, that doesn't mean anything, because these sampler kits also have the original date on them. Hopefully, the person that stitched it will have signed their name as well, but that's not always the case. Now, most samplers are counted cross-stitch, which means you are working on a blank sheet piece of linen, and you have to count those tiny little spaces. You can see this is one that I never finished, but I'm to the point right now that my eyes just aren't good enough to see those tiny little holes, so I really prefer the printed samplers. And if I ever got this one finished, I would have a stunning Jacobean sampler right here. So hopefully, please encourage me to finish this winter, because I really would love to have this one done. Look at that. That's what it would look like if I ever finished it. So how do you display the samplers once you've got them? I think the best way is to display them in a group, in groupings, and you can't see. This whole corner is filled with them, but the Christmas tree is in the way. But I think they look great in groupings, but they also look fine just sitting on a shelf all alone with some books, candles, or teapots. Now, this is the sampler I showed you a few weeks ago. That's absolutely huge, and it looks fine by itself on a wall because it takes up nearly the whole space. We do a video about early textiles without including the quilt, because the quilt is probably, in my opinion, one of the most beloved of all antique textiles. Almost all women quilted, didn't require any special education or art training. All you needed was scraps of your clothing, or remnants of carton fabric, or anything that you had, and you could put together, by using tiny pieces, a beautiful bed covering that was also a work of art. Now, I don't have any extraordinary quilt pieces in here, and I don't even really collect quilts anymore. I have one that I want to show you that I think is pretty special. But what I love about them, and the way you can really tell their age, is by really looking at the fabric. If you are a textile person, if you are a quilter, for example, you know an old fabric when you see one. You can really tell by the designs. Some of these fabrics are incredibly old. Now, I will say that they are reproducing Civil War fabrics right now. In fact, this quilt here, this is not an old quilt, but the fabrics have been reproduced from old fabrics. But you can see that it was actually machine quilted, and it's in excellent condition. It's a beautiful quilt, but it's not an antique. But old fabric styles were used on this quilt. Now, really, you could say that these were pieced together coverlets or covers, because the actual quilting were the little stitches that stitched the batting and the top and the back together, and that is what made the quilting. So what I like to look at is, what was the stitching like? How was the stitching? Was this hand done? Because you know, nowadays quilts are pretty much made on the machine. I have a lot of quilter friends, and most of them do not do their quilting by hand. But the old quilts, they were all done by hand. And sometimes the needleworker wasn't that great, and the lines are a little bit crooked and disheveled, and they're not perfect. But that's what I like about them. Now, although quilting is not strictly an American textile, it really was American women that developed quilting into its finest form in the past. Now, I used to do a lot of quilting when my kids were little, and I remembered all the names of these wonderful patterns: Geese in Flight, Ohio Star, Star of Bethlehem, Pinwheel. I don't remember much of it anymore, but just to think about the fact that what makes these so fascinating is that you could take little bitty pieces of fabric, whatever you had, put it all together very, very carefully, and make an entire king-size bed covering that was beautiful. This, to me, is an extraordinary quilt. It's not that the pattern is so remarkable, because it's just an Ohio star. It's the fabrics that they used. These are the most wonderful, wonderful old fabrics, I swear, and they're so beautiful yet subtle. Now, I know for a fact this is a very old quilt that was made before 1880, and the reason I know that is because in so many places where it's really worn out, you can see the cotton batting, and you can see that it has cotton seeds in it. Now, mechanical cotton seed pickers were not invented until after the 1880s. So any quilt with cotton seeds in it is going to have to be dated before 1880. But just these patterns of this old gorgeous fabrics are so beautiful. I can't decide which ones I like the best. This is really very delicate, because the fabric is just so worn in so many places that I have to be ever so careful with it. And generally, I don't even hang it here. I put it in a fairly dark room and just hang it over a cupboard, but I wanted to be able to show you how beautiful these patterns are from the other side. And some of these colors are still pretty vibrant, and I think that's because I have this basically tucked away most of the time. In a safe room that's dark, it can still be seen, but it doesn't get any sun. So in caring for old textiles, you're a curator, and you really need to take care of them, because this is history. This is a piece of history. It's not an object that you're going to use. Certainly not going to use it except as a beautiful treat for the eyes. So as far as the antique quilts go and the antique coverlets, my advice is don't use them on your bed. We have quilts on every bed in the house, but none of them are antique quilts. I love the look of quilts. I love quilters. Some of my best friends are quilters, and I really appreciate their art form. But something as old as this, I mean, and look at, I just didn't mention that before, but look at how nice and tiny her stitches were. What beautiful straight and lovely stitches she had. There you see that cotton again. That's just so worn away, so fragile. So this is a piece of history that I have to take good care of, and I hope that someday somebody else will take good care of it too. Textile are coverlets or woven blankets. Now, although most women were quilt makers, there were only a limited number of coverlet weavers. Most women did not own a loom, and so they were generally itinerant weavers would come through town, and you would order your coverlet, and it would basically be made right there on the spot. So basically what a coverlet is, it's a woven blanket, and it can be a really thin blanket or can be a rather heavy and thick blanket. The earliest examples were the geometric designs. This would be called an overshot coverlet, and natural dyes were used. Generally, whenever I find a coverlet, it's almost always blue. There'll be shades of blue and a kind of an off-white. The threads used would be wool, linen, and cotton. And oftentimes these were reversible, so on one side you could have a summer that would be called a summer and winter coverlet. So in the summertime you would use the dark colors, and in the winter you would use the light colors. I'll show you a few examples. Example of a summer winter coverlet, and I do want to tell you that coverlets are often in pretty bad condition. This one's really in dreadful condition, so I didn't pay much for it, and a lot of times people will purchase these, and because they're in such shabby shape, they just will take the good parts and turn them into pillows or lampshades or anything like that. But you can see that the geometric designs are, here's the summer side, and here is the winter side. But this one, remember, these were used as coverings. These were used as blankets, and so they get a lot of wear. And this one, I'm just, to display coverlets, basically the best thing to do is to hang them over a closet door or at the end of a bed. But when they're old like this, I would never actually use it as a blanket. It's just a piece of history in your house and something to be really cared for and passed on to the next generation, because you can look at that and you can see how much wear this coverlet got. But now I want to show you a really, really good condition coverlet. This is actually the first one I ever got, I acquired, and it's in wonderful condition. It's a different color, which is kind of odd to see it in these beautiful rust and black and beige colors. It's still got lovely fringe on it, but one thing I wanted to show you about these is that because the looms were often placed on a wagon and taken from village to village, the loom couldn't have been a full-size loom. So the weaver would weave the piece in about a 3-foot width and then make 2 pieces, and then they would be seamed together on the vertical. So sometimes when you find a coverlet that seems awfully small, it's because you've only got half of the coverlet. Somewhere along the line, the other half has disappeared. This would be called an overshot coverlet. Most stunning of all the coverlets, in my opinion, are the jacquard coverlets, and they were done in floral patterns, as you can see here. Beautiful floral patterns and designs. And what I really love about these jacquard coverlets is that they were usually dated. You can see on the very corner the date of 1849, and although it's kind of backward, I don't know why they were backward like this, but on both sides you can see that it's backward, 1849. And this one is in fairly well-used condition because it has been around the bend a bit. But this type of coverlet was generally made in the weaving factories, mid-19th century, and they really are, in my opinion, just some of the prettiest. And this one, if I could figure out how to clean it, I would certainly do so. I do not know how to clean it without hurting it, so I just leave it as a table covering here in the living room and enjoy it like that. But let me show you one that's really in good condition. Incredible, incredible coverlet. It's pretty heavy, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. It is in excellent condition. But just look at the beautiful pattern, the birds, the florals in the middle, the berries, the leaves, and the border is absolutely marvelous. And as you can see, when you flip it over, you've got a summer-winter coverlet. But the odd thing about this coverlet is the date. This weaving is very odd because it has 2 dates here in the corner, 1840 and 1940. So my theory is, because I do not know, but my theory is that the original design was from 1840 and somebody wove it in 1940. Other than that, that would certainly explain to me why it is in such excellent shape, because it's not as old as the other ones. It's around 80 years old, and I don't even know how much it was used. But I'm telling you, this would be a very warm blanket. But once again, because of the nature of the coverlets, I would just use this maybe on the end of a bed in a guest room, or just hang it over a couch, because it's just really an incredibly beautiful piece. And it's going to blow your mind when I tell you that I only paid about $70 for this coverlet, which is very, very, very good. Now I want to show you a coverlet that is what you would want to look for if you were shopping for coverlets, because this is got so many great qualities about it. Number one, it's 4 different colors. It's turquoise, beige, navy blue, and red. Also, you can see right here where it was stitched, the seamed right down the middle in the two pieces. Oh dear. Hello, Stella. Stella, I really don't like you to be on there. Oh, Stella, that you're not supposed to be on this coverlet, but that's okay. It's only for a few minutes. What's really wonderful about this is that it's got the abbreviated date of the town that it was woven in, which is Mercerville, Pennsylvania. It's also got the name of the weaver, Schultz, and Nancy B. Tenley in 1847 is who this was woven for. So it's got the name of the weaver, the town it was woven in, the year it was woven in, and the person it was woven for. That makes this a really special find and a really gorgeous piece of history. And now I think we better hang it up. It's also reversible. So you've got your winter coverlet, and you've got your summer colors on the other side. So what can you expect to pay for a coverlet? If you can find a coverlet with all the best qualities, especially if it's in really good condition, you might be looking at hundreds of dollars. But if you're really a bargain hunter and you know what you're looking for and you're in a thrift store, you could probably pick one up for $30 to $50, because sometimes people, well, some people, they just don't want those antiques that were passed down from their grandma or their mother-in-law, and they're just trying to sell them. So it just depends. I would look for the coverlets in the best condition and with the best qualities, like this one here. To display them, hang them over a door, hang them over a railing, hang them over a beam. Make sure you fold them, get in there and refold them occasionally. You don't want them always folded on the same line, because that wears down the edges. You have to be a good curator of these things. And also at the foot of a bed in a guest room, perhaps. They look good like that too, or over a quilt rack. Well, my tea is cold now, but I thank you for allowing me to share my love of old worn things, and some things not so old, but quite beautiful. You are perfectly welcome to put in your 2 cents worth. Perhaps you're a quilter or stitcher or a needleworker or a collector yourself, and you have something to say about it, or maybe I got something wrong and you'd like to add to it, so please feel free to do that. I was going to do some cooking in this video, but I've decided to do the entire meal all in one video, because I'm going to do a Dickens Christmas brunch, Victorian brunch, and I think it would be a lot more impressive and a lot more interesting if I cooked everything in the same video. So perhaps that'll be next time, perhaps not, or perhaps we'll talk about Bethlehem, or perhaps we'll just chat a little bit more about the history of Christmas. Maybe we will do the cooking video next week or in a few days. The videos will be closer together now that we're so close to the holidays. But I've had a bit of a cold, and I really didn't want to be doing any cooking when I got this nasty cough. So, from Hopalong Hollow, Stella and Titus and James and I wish you a fond farewell until next time. Bye-bye.